Hello and welcome to another episode of Alte Herren. My name is Rob Runacres and I'm joined by my friend Hans Jodelind, who's going to introduce tonight's guest.
Yes, I will. Today we have Tim Hall from Virginia Academy of Fencing. So wrestling today. How are you, Tim?
I'm doing well. Thank you guys for having me.
Hey, Tim.
Cool. Okay, we're going to start right away. Can you describe the wrestling you do and how it's different from other forms of wrestling?
Yeah, it's, well, in its most basic sense, it's medieval wrestling, right? So the sources call it Ringen, but depending on your audience, if they're German speaking, that just means wrestling. So it doesn't always work. So medieval wrestling is a good way to differentiate between modern and historical styles. Specifically, what I work from are the German sources written all in the German language from the 15th and 16th centuries.
You mentioned right away. Difference between modern and medieval wrestling. Can you kind of expand on that? What is the difference between modern wrestling and medieval wrestling for people who don't know?
Yeah. So the medieval sources they're different in a couple of senses. For one, the way we approach studying it, right? We're trying to revive an art that has either died or evolved into something else. So we're working from books to recreate an art. In addition to that, it's not just a sport, right? Wrestling nowadays is a sport in the Olympics, and that's that, right? So the Ringen, the historical sources presented it as both a sport and a way to defend yourself, or a martial art to use under various circumstances. They had both Gesellglich and nicht Gesellglich techniques, which are friendly and not friendly techniques. And depending on why you're studying, you would maybe choose to use one or another. Additionally, it was created as a wrestling system to be integrated into your use of the various medieval weapons of the time, right? So it's not just unarmed fighting, it's unarmed fighting to supplement the sword fighting or staff fighting or a single-handed sword or whatever you're doing.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so when we're talking about these sources, are they part of wider sources? Are they sort of like, say, part of a longsword treatise or something like that? Certainly from my experience in Renaissance sources, you see occasional techniques tacked on to, a side sword or a rapier treatise, or are we seeing something that's definitively separate and evolved in its own right?
You're seeing both, right? So some of the earlier stuff, we have Alte that was included in the pseudo Peter von Danzig treatise, right? So that's a source that includes longsword, fighting from horseback, wrestling in and outside of armor, fighting with dagger, right? So that's there. And then we also have later stuff like Fabian von Auerswald's work, which is just wrestling. It doesn't have anything else, not even dagger work, which are sometimes very closely related to the Ringen stuff.
And are these sources actually following some form of set of principles and methodology, or are we seeing a series of techniques really in progression? Is there something quite developed there?
I think it depends on which source you're looking at, right? So I imagine that in the time, the various masters had their own methodologies, right? But that doesn't always come through depending on the source that you're studying. We have in Alte and then also Codex Wallerstein, they talk about Vornach and Indes. They talk about how to approach different types of fighters. If you're lighter or heavier, or the same strength or skill as someone, how you might fight them. But then we have like von Auerswald, who's a little bit later, for example, who I'll come back to a lot because that's my main area of focus. He actually, in the name of his book, it says 85 pieces or 85 techniques, right? He doesn't really talk about principles too much. He presents a series of techniques, quite a bit of them, and you can pick up concepts and general ideas of how to wrestle and the things that you should do in wrestling, but he doesn't always come right out and say them like some of the other sources might. So, both.
Okay, and are we seeing at all in any of the sources kind of like a linked tradition develops there, or is it possible to infer something?
I think there is a tradition, right? Well, actually, do you mean between the historical sources together, or do you mean between historical and modern?
I think I'm looking at the sources at the moment. We'll probably go on and ask about, some of the difficulties of looking at it from such a distance and mixing the modern. But for the moment, is can you see this sort of traditional? Again, from my period, you see a Bolognese system, so-called. You see a progression of things. I'm wondering if you see that in the wrestling sources.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Some are more similar than others, but I think if you look at Alte, and then Codex Wallerstein, then Fabian von Auerswald, and then the Landshuter manuscript, and then Paulus Hector Meyer later on, you have some of the same techniques that are repeated by all of these sources, and some of them are actually pretty close to being just copies of each other, right? So you definitely see, if not a tradition, at least people who are studying the same sorts of techniques or may have come across the same types of people. So yeah, I think you can draw something there, but we don't have anything that says this is a wrestling tradition outside maybe the fact that his works show up in so many of the different sources, right? They're in, I think, Ringen, they're in the pseudo Peter von Danzig, and they show up in other sources as well.
Are they using the same terminology consistently?
No, no, they're not. Some of them do, right? But I think von Auerswald, for the most part, is the only one who names so many of his techniques, right? You do see names that show up in some of the other sources, but it's not the norm sometimes, right? There's different names. Even something as simple as going under the arm could be called Durchschlafen by one master, Durchschliffen by another, and so yeah, just different ways to call things, and I think that's probably the same thing we might expect from modern practitioners, right? They'll have different names for different techniques within their art if they're using modern terminology to describe the actions.
How do you approach that then, particularly when you're trying to convey the technique to students and so on? And I can imagine there are also a number of arguments where people are having, no, it's not the same thing, it's called something else.
Yeah.
Blah, 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 blah.
Oh, yeah.
How do you approach that inconsistency then?
So I go to von Auerswald as my default, right? He's just what I use. If he's got a name for it, that's what I call a technique. Although I recognize in teaching folks outside of my school, or even just discussing with folks outside of my school, sometimes they might have different terminology. So saying, giving the technique name, which may or may not be the same, and then probably just describing the action, right? Wrestling is so easy. We don't need to bust out the plastic forks and knives at the dinner table. We can just talk about it wherever we are.
If Hans will allow me, just on a tangent here then, do you find that the community in wrestling is a little more amicable, a little more easygoing on some of the discussions on this side than maybe some of us find it in other areas?
I think it appears to be that way, yeah. There are fewer people doing it as well, so maybe it's just that the people who are not in agreement with the majority are just not speaking up, and there are so few of them that they don't make it through. But in general, yeah, I think we tend to agree on things. It's very easy to say, no, that doesn't work, and then to show that, no, that doesn't work if it doesn't work.
Okay, can you give us some details about a particular treatise or a particular master that's of interest to you?
Yeah, my primary focus is with Fabian von Auerswald's Ringerkunst. This is a wrestling-only source, and it was completed in 1537. Von Auerswald, the master who sourced all the techniques here, he was 75 when this work was completed, and you can actually see in the images he's an old guy in the images doing the techniques. So it's really cool to see someone at his age doing this stuff. Because wrestling is not an easy art. It's hard on the body. But he was the wrestling master for John Friedrich I, who was the Elector of Saxony, and he was the head of the Protestant Confederation of Germany. His source was illustrated, von Auerswald's treatise was illustrated in the workshop of Lucas Cranach, who's a famous German artist. There's some disagreement as to whether or not it was the elder or the younger, but one of them created his work, or at least in that workshop, and his treatise, von Auerswald's treatise, was printed by Hans Luft, who also printed Martin Luther's Bible, right, the first complete edition of the Bible, which was done 5 years prior to printing Ringerkunst. So he's very heavily associated with sort of the Protestant Reformation and that movement in that area. Really cool to see the context of when this wrestling work was published and the people who were practicing it.
Okay, I think your dogs are disagreeing with you on some of this.
Yeah.
But to put it in context as well, this is so it's 1537, you say, so it's like a year after, I think. Yeah. So, excuse me, I got that wrong, and also, a little bit after Mancelino, which are two of the big Bolognese treatises happening in Italy, and it's sort of the beginning then of this mid-16th century explosion of fight books and treatises.
Yeah, we see a lot of the German sources are maybe earlier than this, right? And I think von Auerswald is sort of the tail end of maybe some of the earlier style of wrestling that we see. He was born in 1462, he says. So he lived through some of the other stuff we've seen and is in a period where it's transitioning into the later stuff, according to his lifetime, right? And you actually see in Ringerkunst, you can see that he has an older style of clothing on, where some of his partners demonstrating techniques have sort of a newer style of clothing on, which is really cool.
Okay. That's fantastic. Okay, and how important do you think he was viewed at the time? And one of the things we see in treatises is a lot of the treatises that are seen as important today are simply those that have been translated first or found first. Do we know anything about this individual and how he was viewed by his peers?
I do not. Maybe someone does, but I don't. He says that he was the wrestling master for John Friedrich, right? So somebody important he was a wrestling master for. He said he taught the princes and nobles of the court. So he was teaching a lot of other important people. And he was important enough to have his work printed by Hans Luft. And I think there were a couple of different copies that we have now. And even later on, somebody took his work, and there's the manuscript version where somebody who I believe is probably not von Auerswald, somebody sometime later went through and wrote about a page of description after each technique or after each page of the book. So he was involved in some important stuff with some important people, and was, after he died, his work was still considered to be important enough for someone to go and make a manuscript about it. So I think we can say he was probably pretty important. Also, actually, one more thing, if you don't mind, I completely forgot this earlier. His family actually went on to do some things within the political system in Europe in that area. I don't remember exactly the details, but I know that he comes from a pretty high family, and they wanted him to do some great things. Actually, if you just kind of follow a Google trail or Wikipedia trail, you can see the stuff that his relatives were involved in, which is pretty cool.
Excellent. Is there actually anywhere that someone can, is it on Wiktor now, or is there somewhere that people can go and find this source?
Yeah, if you go on Wiktor now, it's definitely on there. Just search for Ringerkunst or Fabian von Auerswald. It's, I think, the only thing that shows up if you search those terms, right? James Clock did a translation of the work. You can find it on his website, although I think he may have updated the translation when they posted it on Wiktor Now, so that's probably the best place to pull it from. But if you want a PDF version, James Clock's website, if you Google Clock Tower with a K, that's how I usually find it.
Okay. And yeah. just as an add-on to that, the other sources, the main sources, is wiktornow.com again the place to start with?
For the most part, yeah. Definitely if you're looking for anything free and quick, you can go on the website and pull it up. Although Jessica Finley actually has a great book on medieval wrestling where she talks about Alte, who was a prevalent Jewish master in his art. So that's also a great point for people to start from, to pick up her book and read through it, which also gives you some great context about the background in the environment in which medieval wrestling was practiced.
That's it. I'm selling all my swords now. I'm just starting wrestling instead, I think. Okay, let's move on to the competition side. We have seen you in competitions. You won gold at Swordfish now, and yep. In competition, do you feel that the rules in the competition, wrestling competitions that we have in HEMA, that the rules restrict you from practicing the full form, so to speak?
They do, right? In a way, they do. We can't break people's elbows and dislocate their shoulders and gouge their eyes and things like that, right? Those are all common in some of the medieval sources. Obviously, we can't do those kinds of things to our friends or even our opponents in competition, because then there won't be a next year, right? So there are restrictions. And I designed the rules for the ring competition at Long Point, and I run that event every year, with the exception of this past year where I competed. And that's something that I work through is trying to decide what we allow and what we don't allow. Obviously, anything that directly will injure somebody is not allowed, right? Although those are present in the sources. And also working to encourage the use of historical technique and discourage the use of modern techniques that are not present in the historical sources.
Can I just interrupt on there? I think what might be useful is if you actually describe, obviously it's going to be one of those things where lots of exceptions, but can you describe what constitutes medieval wrestling? Because I think lots of people are going to think of Greco-Roman on one side, BJJ on another, and they're not necessarily going to have that full picture. So I'm wondering if you can just describe that for us.
I think to someone who's unfamiliar with it, who may be familiar with other grappling arts, the best way to describe it is a combination between wrestling and judo, right? So it's focused on throwing people. There's very little groundwork discussed in the historical sources. There are wrestling techniques where you grab the legs and you shoot double leg, single leg takedowns, but there are also hip throws, right? And various trips and leg sweeps and things like that. So in addition to that, there's also clothing grips. So a combination between wrestling and judo, and in my opinion, we get sort of the best of both worlds, right? Those are both arts that I enjoy separately, and when I practice Ringen, I get to enjoy it all together.
Okay, and you mentioned the clothing. Is it Jess Finley, I think, who's designed the jacket that's very popular now? There's a specific sort of clothing gear that you have to wear, or can you be fairly freeform with it? What sort of thing do you need?
So what the jackets do, the Jess Finley jacket, what that does is allow you to practice the grips on the clothes that we see in the sources, right? if you grab a T-shirt, you're going to rip it, right? You're going to need a new T-shirt every time you're working a technique, and then in free wrestling, you can't do the clothing grips because you're ripping your clothes off, and then things get a little bit weird. So these jackets allow you to practice that portion of the art, the clothing grips in the entries and things like that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an asset to anyone who's trying to train any form of medieval wrestling, is to have some sort of jacket that you can grip, because those techniques are definitely there in the sources.
And to be quite clear, this is different from like a gi, one of the heavy duty gis that a judoka might wear. It's got more of a classic shape. We'll put a picture up for this, but I'm just wondering if you can perhaps describe the difference and why there's this difference.
Yeah, so it's based on medieval clothing, right? Jess Finley does a lot of reproduction work with medieval clothing, and so she based her design of these wrestling jackets on that style. So they tend to be sort of tight around the forearm and then looser on the upper arm. We want something that's closer fitting on the body, although that's a little bit difficult to replicate in a jacket that also needs to be durable enough to throw somebody with. It's not sort of folded over jacket like we see in judo, right? It's just sort of a V collar that allows you to slip in and out, even though some medieval clothing might have had just a full collar there. But it's a modern design based on the medieval aesthetic, essentially.
So the clothing itself, is it based on a 14th century or 15th century type of arming jacket? Is it specifically like a military or under armor garment, or is it a civilian garb?
I think it probably falls somewhere in between. I'm not sure exactly what she was looking at for the styling when she designed the jackets. But if you look through the sources, right, Talhofer is a good example. You can see the clothing in that one. Von Auerswald has some later period clothing that's a little bit more ornate than what we see in the wrestling jackets. But kind of just based on the types of clothing we see in the historical sources.
Okay, cool. Hans?
Yeah, we're going to stay on the competition talk a little bit. Sometimes we hear criticisms, well, within the weapon-based sparring, that competitions are not real because people are not respecting the weapons as if they were sharp. Is this something that you also hear about? I mean, what's your perspective on this when it comes to wrestling?
I don't think we see that as much, right? It's hard to ignore a planet hitting you. So, you know, if you look at my competition footage from the finals at Swordfish here a few weeks ago, the first two techniques I do, one I pick my opponent up and slam him down, and then the other I do a technique called degobble, which is sort of a big hip throw where my leg goes up in between his legs to throw him onto his back. We were on a mat, right? And so he was perfectly fine to continue going and so on. If we were on harder ground, then it might not have turned out so well, right? So wrestling either works or it doesn't, right? We don't have this concern for, oh, if it was a sharp sword, you wouldn't have done that, right? Wrestling is always sharp, kind of, if we can describe it that way. We don't have to get into arguments as to whether or not a technique would work, because it either does or doesn't when you go to use it.
Sure. When we're putting together the questions, I realized that could be seen as a bit of a stupid question in some ways. I think where I was thinking... No,
I think it is a good question.
Well, no, I mean, it was more about you can obviously throw someone and you can get them off balance and etc. But how much does the technical accuracy come into play on that? Because there's going to be a sloppy throw, and then there's going to be something that's really quite pristine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it comes down to the skill level, the skill gap between opponents, right? Obviously, when someone is entirely outclassed, it's easy for the opponent to demonstrate very clean skill. When two guys are pretty evenly matched, then things might get a little sloppier. Although at high levels, we still see good, clean technique prevailing when it comes through. And we are definitely getting there in competitive ringing. But it's a process to get there, right? Yeah. Sometimes things will be sloppy. Even if you look at Olympic judo, sometimes those matches are very sloppy, right? And then other times you see just beautiful actions. So I think that will always be present in competition, and that's just the nature of two people trying their best to not be beaten.
Do you ever use it do you ever do wrestling and in combination with dagger or any other things, like weapons or pugilism or something?
Yeah, I do. I also practice longsword and everything that goes along with that, right? All those different weapons that we have. Yeah, I don't have any striking experience myself, so that's not something that I've journeyed into, although there are some strikes in Ringen generally to vulnerable areas. Punching someone into the stomach in order to set up a throw, or hitting them in the face in order to set something up. So in that sense, I've done some striking, but nothing like some of the pugilistic arts that we have later on. With dagger, of course, there's Ringen and dagger that I've worked with, and then also in my longsword work, I tend to avoid wrestling when I have a sword in my hand because I've got a sharpened piece of steel that I can hit you with instead. But when it does come to a situation where it's appropriate to use it, yes, having a wrestling background is definitely helpful there, and it does come out to play when we get there.
Okay, I've got one question here, which may be a little bit controversial. I don't know. We saw at Swordfish, a very experienced judoka won the heavyweight division. And that was in stark contrast to yours was the middleweight division. I remember speaking to you at the time. You were very pleased about doing you were able to name the techniques you used from the treatises. And the winner of the lightweight, the Finnish gentleman, he was also able to do the same. So that must irk you slightly to see a non-HEMA person going in there and winning, in a division like that, using a different martial form. How do you feel about that? Is it actually a problem? And as a follow-up question, what would you do?
I actually think it's a good thing, right? To throw a curveball there. I would encourage folks from other arts to come and participate in our competitions because they encourage us to train harder and to get better. Right, judo and wrestling have a pretty long and traditional background of successful competitors and successful coaches teaching successful competitors, and so they have some very, very good and skilled people, and we can only get better by crossing over with them. So I like that he was there. I think he put on a great show, and the great thing about the Swordfish rules and also what I've tried to do with the long point rules is that even if you're doing judo or wrestling or have a background in another art, when you come and compete in these events, you have to do Ringen to win, right? Like I said, Ringen is similar to wrestling and judo put together. So there are very few techniques that are not present in the historical sources that are in the modern sources. It's just a matter of emphasizing the things that we see in the historical sources over modern variations. So an example that I think is pretty easy to picture here, if we have the low single leg takedown that we see in modern wrestling, right, where the knee slides across the floor and they grab low on the leg and then they stand back up and they've got the guy's leg. We don't see that in any of the historical sources. They remain standing when they grab the leg. So if we create a rule set that either does not encourage or punishes that kind of action, and encourages or rewards the type of action that we see in the historical sources instead, then someone who has a wrestling background can come and modify their technique and do that technique and maybe even win the competition with it. And as long as they were still doing what we can identify as Ringen, then that's great. After all, Ringen is just the German word for wrestling. So I think that historically they would have been perfectly fine practicing and competing against people with other arts.
I think it's a difficult one. It's interesting being someone who's very much on the sword-based side. I don't know what you think, Hans, is that Swordfish had great contrast in the types of sword play. You had very good historical technique, some of the sort of buckler fight, certainly in the final for longsword, stuff like that. And then you saw in other areas, you saw very much a sporting approach, whereby it was more about gaining more points rather than being, and I go in inverted commas here, martially sound, because what is martially sound, of course. Did you see this? I mean, when looking at the judoka who won, did you see such a difference in the form and in the skill set between the past and the historical?
Yes, right, but probably not as drastically as we might see with some of the sword stuff. You know, the end goal was to throw somebody, so you get points by doing the throw, right? You couldn't really do small things to kind of, you know, get 1 point here and another point there. You have to actually throw someone to win. So his end goal was the same. So he couldn't really kind of cheat the rules, and not saying that he would have if he could have, right? He was using some different grips than we see in the sources, right? And that's identifiable. You can see the aesthetic of judo is a little bit different than what we see in Ringen, and that was visible if you have an eye for that sort of thing. I don't know how well other people can identify some of the really small differences that we might see. But it's hard to imagine a way to gain points in a wrestling competition when the goal is to throw someone, right? Although certainly if you have ways to push somebody out of the ring maybe and get points doing that, maybe people would start doing that. So I think that's a matter of changing our rule set to encourage the types of actions that we want to see. And as long as we have our rules solid in the sense that they're encouraging what we want and discouraging what we don't want, anyone can come in and do, you know, good. I don't know, martially sound. That kind of that terminology doesn't work so well with wrestling, right? Everything is martially sound to a certain degree with wrestling, right? You put them on the ground and you get on top of them and you're good to go.
I would like to know how do you want the Ringen tournament to develop? I mean, what's the next step, so to speak?
Sure. I think we're at a good place right now. Not done, right? We're not done developing, but we're on the right track. We have different rule sets at different events that seem to be good overall. And we see the skill level increasing every time these events happen. Long Point this year was some of the best Ringen that I've seen. This is my first time at Swordfish, but I was incredibly impressed by the skill level that was displayed there. So we're moving in the right direction, and I think we need to continue that. What I'd like to see is more people involved. We have sort of an issue right now where at a competition people show up and they're going for the sword arts, right? So that's their focus. And they either don't sign up for Ringen because they're not interested, or they might sign up and get injured and drop out, or they're tired and drop out. So sometimes we have issues with participation at the Ringen competitions. So what I'd like to see are larger numbers of people signing up and people who are dedicated to competing. who aren't just signing up for the hell of it and then dropping out, or even folks who practice Ringen alone, who show up and want to compete, and maybe they don't have anything to do with this sword stuff. That would be great too. So,
but don't you have an inherent problem there on two levels?
Yeah.
How do you get into Ringen?
Mm-hmm.
Which, you know, is unless you are someone who's going to be interested in judo or something, it's more likely to be a transfer thing. And secondly, you're going to have a problem about going up against these sword jockeys. You know, people who flail around with long swords and so on. That's the cool thing that attracts most people.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So how do you get past those two things?
Well, you know, I think part of it is just building a culture where people are interested in it. I don't know about in Europe, but rapier, I know it's close to your heart, Rob. Rapier in the U.S. is getting more and more popular every year. And I think initially we might have seen some of that same issue where people were doing longsword and maybe did some rapier on the side, and then they wouldn't compete in it or weren't interested. And then we see people start doing the competitions and more show up, and it becomes a bigger thing. And now it has always been its own thing, but now people are seeing it as its own thing. Maybe Ringen can develop in a similar way, right? Maybe people can come to see Ringen as useful outside of the sword arts, and we can pull people in who maybe aren't interested in doing any sort of the sword stuff. Not that they shouldn't be, because you can certainly do both, right? I do longsword and also Ringen. I compete in both of them most of the time. Sometimes I don't. But yeah, I think some outreach within our community and outside of our community, getting more people interested. I think right now we have a large number of folks who would do Ringen if they had someone to learn from. And that's certainly a problem because it is sort of specialized. It's difficult to just pick up one of the sources and say, oh, now I know how to wrestle. And then you show up to a competition and you find out, well, I didn't know anything. I guess I don't know how to do this.
No, I don't know. There's enough people in Rapier who seem to pick up a source and then say they know everything. Let's leave that.
Yeah.
Do you have much?
That was bitter, Rob. That was so fun.
Do you have much contact? Because like these guys, to Talent to Stock, they've got a very, very big wrestling section. So I don't know whether you've had much contact in Europe outside of the Nordic scene with those guys.
Sorry, I didn't hear who you were asking about.
De Talent de Stock. It's a big club in Dijon. They do a lot of wrestling. So I think in the French scene, wrestling is quite big. So I don't know if
they.
Have you
I don't think they were at Swordfish this year, right? They were there last year, but they weren't at this most recent event.
A couple of years ago, I think. No, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I've heard that they're talented. I've heard they're very good. I haven't had any interaction with them.
No, they were very good when it came to Swordfish. That was fantastic to have them there. They had a huge French community just sitting there cheering for each other and had great wrestling. I missed them this year. I was hoping they would come, and it was fantastic to have next year to have an even bigger American community. You know, just sitting there and just fighting, and also the French guys. That would be fantastic.
Yeah,
but I hear what you're saying. I think maybe there needs to be I don't know, but I mean maybe there needs to be more sideways movement, as I say, if you can get more international contact, and that tends to build the interest outside as well as inside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'd love to meet those guys. I'd love to wrestle with those guys. I'm sure they're doing great stuff. Yeah, if any sort of cooperation we can get across people who are interested in the same things, the better.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. There was one last thing, I think, actually. Didn't you have something you wanted to mention to us?
Yes, yeah. So I have been going back just a moment ago when I said people are interested, but they don't have any way to study Ringen. I've been working with a couple of US-based instructors, and we will have a larger announcement coming soon. But basically, we've been working on a way, sort of paving the way for people who are interested in learning Ringen who may not have access to an experienced instructor. We're working on a way to make Ringen more attainable to them. I don't want to give too much information. We'll have more later. But if that's something that the viewers here are interested in, keep an eye open for it. And hopefully we'll be able to do some great stuff. And hopefully we'll be able to promote Ringen and encourage growth within the folks that are practicing Ringen, and start moving towards some of the stuff we see with the sword arts, where we see lots of competitors and big competitions that are oriented only towards the particular weapon. I think that will be certainly one of our goals, is to help promote Ringen events. So look out for that when it comes.
Okay, cool. I think if people are interested, however, in seeing Ringen, they've obviously got the opportunity at Long Point if you're in the States, and I guess Fish, of course, the competitions there. I would also mention Dijon, which will be in early May. There's a big focus on it. Is there anywhere else you perhaps recommend? We're going to put some links up, I think, to a lot of your stuff on here. Is there anywhere you'd recommend to go see Ringen?
Yeah, I think in the U.S. probably the only event that comes to mind in the U.S. Is probably SURFA, the Southeastern Renaissance Fencing Open, that the Atlanta Fry Factor and I think some of the other local groups in Atlanta put on. They have a Ringen event that is very similar rule set to Long Point and Swordfish. Some of the same concepts that we see in those rules. I'm not sure outside of that, right? I think there was maybe some Eastern European groups who are also doing Ringen competition, but I don't know.
There was a demonstration I saw some years back in Dijon of Polish wrestling, where they had special things, like one guy had to hop and the other guy didn't have to hop, and he had to do
yeah.
Polish stuff. Doing that.
We have that in von Auerswald stuff. It's let me see if I can find it real quick. I've got it right here next to me. Here we go. This is Ringen and Brubline, where one guy has to keep his foot in the hole, and the other guy has to hop on one leg, and they wrestle each other. Actually, it's a great game for practicing some of the leg hook techniques that we see in von Auerswald and some of the other sources.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much. So, so you're saying Atlanta, that's Keith Cotter Riley's group as well, and Mackenzie Ewing and those guys, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Tim, Devlin Hall, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.